We have arrived. This is Webb Parton, your host, and we welcome you to the Free Range Dogs podcast. This is a place where we stake out a shady spot and talk about all things dog. Find yourself a soft piece of grass, spin a few circles, plop down, rest your feet, and join us in this joyful conversation. Hi, everyone out there. This is Webb Parton with Free Range Dogs, and we're back for another episode, and I think what's going to be a great conversation with Chris Madson. Chris, I've known for a few years now, and Chris, you are a writer par excellence, and you have a new book that's coming out on dogs, the favorite subject of the Free Range Dogs podcast. But if you would, say hello and let the folks know who you are.
Oh, what a pleasure to talk with you, Webb. It always is. I guess my short bio is I trained in wildlife biology and spent 36 or 37 years working in two state wildlife agencies, one in Kansas and the other one in Wyoming. And through that whole time, I was freelance writing and doing some photography as well. And I was also doing my first love, which was, hunting, fishing, outdoor thing. So the book is essentially it's kind of a contemplation on the relationship that I've had between myself and the working dogs I've been privileged to share the home and field with over all these years. There's a fair amount of hunting in it, but it's really mostly about the dogs. It's hard to talk, for me at least, hard to talk about hunting dogs without talking about hunting. But it really is not any kind of a technical rendition on how to train bird dogs, the different kinds of bird dogs. It sure is no brag on my ability as a dog trainer or as a wing shooter. It's really mostly about that relationship. And, as is often the case with that kind of thing, a fair amount of philosophy creeps in, I think, around the edges. So if you love dogs, this might be a read that you enjoy.
Yeah, and the name of the book is True Companions, through Stackpole, and it has been released now, so it is available.
Yep.
I think this is our 32nd episode. Kind of amazing where the time goes. But, early on it was a conversation about, and it focused on dog training and dog interactions and those sorts of things. But, the more and more that we've done these and more conversations I have, it really is about the relationship between a person and a dog or their dogs. Yeah. And it's about that shared passion, that shared life, really. I can't imagine living without a dog or dogs, as the case has been in my situation.
Yep.
And I've tried to focus too on the term free range dogs, but that kind of applies to the people that have those dogs as well. If you think about it. Okay.
Yeah.
And you certainly qualify as a free range dog. You've led a life outdoors. You've followed your passion, so to speak, wildlife biology and living in that world and working in that world. And, your home is in Wyoming. So that really, I think, kind of focuses that unique bond between a person and their dogs. And you've had, principally Brittany Spaniels?
Yeah, I have. In the introduction to this book, my dear friend Tom Reed accused me of being a Brittany man, first, foremost, and forever. And I guess that's a fair description of most of my adult life. But I grew up with one of the last really fine Irish setters. It's an indication of just how strong his genes were that I think he lived to be 17, which, for that breed is almost unheard of. Mm-hmm. But a sweet dog, well-mannered, and then an English setter, And then about the time I was leaving home, my dad started with a couple of labs. I ended up with a yellow lab that I took for a friend who was moving and couldn't hold on to the dog. And tried my hand at one red setter, quote unquote, that turned out to be a genetic nightmare, and died young. And then, so I had an adult lab, that I worked through, a golden. But when I finished up my graduate work, like an awful lot of starving would-be wildlife biologists, I spent about a year looking for a job. And in that time, I got work at Nilo Farms and Kennels, which is the Winchester demonstration shooting preserve. And had a whole shooting season there. And I was about ready to leave, having finally landed a job in scenic Kansas. And one of the kennel guys came up to me and said, "Say, Kansas, you could probably use a bird dog, couldn't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I could." And he said, "Let me tell you." He said, at that point, that kennel had 5 national retriever champions, with their labs, and 3 national springer champions with their springers. And so 99.8% of all of the dog work that was done for customers, clients, was one of those 2 breeds. If somebody absolutely demanded he needed to see points, they had a big Ryman-style setter, male, stylish dog and rock solid, and they used him. Nilo is Olin spelled backwards, and so it was John Olin's baby, the CEO at Winchester. And he had a big quail plantation down in Georgia. And from time to time, a few of the dogs that got trained down there would end up, at Nilo Kennels in Illinois. And they had 2 Brittany Spaniels, William and Lee, that were they were fine little dogs. They were just not in the rotation. And they were looking at probably finding a buyer for both of them, trying to get them out in the world instead of just kind of sitting there.
Yeah.
And so they approached me and said, "Well, you might take a look at these 2 dogs and see what you think." Mm-hmm. And so, both of them trained on bobwhite quail in Georgia by, high-end professional trainers. I took William out first, and he was fine little dog, and then took Lee out, and he was even better. Mm-hmm. And so when I went west to Kansas in that January, Lee was on the rider truck seat next to me. Mm-hmm. And there's actually I've actually got a chapter in the book of, that's one of only 2 times that I've ever started out a relationship with an adult dog. And those of you who have done that recognize that is I wouldn't say fraught, but it's not an automatic kind of a thing to strike up a relationship with a 3.5-year-old dog like that right out of the box. Mm-hmm. And he was a marvel in the field, but it was a year, I would say, before one evening, as I write in the book, one evening, we're coming back from an excellent pheasant hunt. It's after dark, and he's done what great bird dogs do. He's given just about everything he had over the course of an entire day. And he watched the road for a mile or 2 and then decided he was going to lie down. And when he lay down, instead of curling up on the right side of the seat, he came over, lay down, and put his muzzle on my knee as I was driving, mm-hmm. which was the first sign that I had that he had accepted me mm-hmm. as a partner. Mm-hmm. And he was such a fine dog that it kind of hooked me on Brittany's. And at that time, Brittany's were not a particularly popular breed, and that tends, I think, to work in one's favor as well, because you have to worry less about irresponsible breedings, pairings. It seems to me the percentage of dogs that have real talent tends to be higher in those breeds that are being carefully monitored. Mm-hmm. And so so I started with Lee as an adult, and then have worked my way through a succession of Brittany's. I'm looking at 2 of them that are curled up in their boxes here right now, having spent the morning running after pheasants.
Well, with Lee, what, because you're right. That's been my experience. And having had a few older dogs come in, they've had a life and they have a history with human beings. And sometimes that because when a dog bonds, it's like, it's super glue. I mean, that's their person, and if that gets ripped away a time or two, it can be really hard. But if that dog was raised in a shooting preserve and he went through a series of trainers and a series of handlers, and they get kind of wobbly. They don't quite know where solid ground is yet. So
it was fascinating with him. We moved that January, and so January, February, March, I was exercising, but I wasn't really doing anything else with him. When spring came along, though, I said, I'm going to find out just exactly what I've got with this dog. And, took him out and started throwing tennis balls, and, cripes, he was well broke on retrieving, just out and back, sit and deliver to hand, just marvelous. And so I thought, well, this is way, way cool. And so one evening on the way home from work, I stopped and got a retrieving bumper. And I said, we're going to do this formally. And I whistled him up when I got home and sat him down and said, okay, and put that bumper out in front of his nose to give him a look at it before I threw it. And when I put the bumper out where he could see it, he closed his eyes and turned his head away.
Mm-hmm.
and when I threw the bumper, he refused to get it.
Yeah.
It's the only thing anything else, any bird, any inanimate object, he would retrieve instantaneously. It's clear that somebody, probably a junior wannabe Labrador trainer in that kennel, had taken the same approach with him that he would take with a lab. And Brittany's are a lot different dog than most labs, especially labs that are being raised to trial seriously. And he just refused. He clearly had an awful experience with the bumper. And as you point out, that experience couldn't have been, in terms of his interaction with that human, had to be just as awful.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is telling about that exchange you're describing is that he was honest with you.
Yeah.
And he communicated with you. All right.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when it's been really bad, they sort of go inside themselves. They kind of go away, I've seen a host of behaviors, but all of it is a detachment almost. And often when I get dogs in where there were problems, I had to wait for them to feel safe enough around me to express themselves, to be honest. Yeah.
And I certainly felt that distance with him. There was nothing in the way of performance. There was no question that he was perfect. I mean, he was absolutely a number one perfect in the field. But for almost an entire hunting season and for more than a year of actually, being in the house, being a part of the family, essentially, you could definitely feel that distance until that one evening. And he decided, okay, I think this is going to be all right. And it just brings a tear to my eye to think about it.
Yeah. And were you his person, or did he bond in with the other members of the family as well?
Oh, well, Brittany's and setters, I guess my experience with them has been, what sappy, affectionate creatures they are.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, he was affectionate with my wife. And at that point we had, infant toddler daughters, and he was marvelous around those little kids crawling around on the floor and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. He finally ended up, being part of the family instead of standing off.
Yeah. Now, normally folks, when they come into the bird dog world, they, the steps are awkward and it's a bit wobbly, and it takes a dog or two or three, to reach near the level that Lee was when you got him. Okay.
Yeah.
And so how did that work for you? Because you kind of reversed the roles. You were the one that, when you got the second dog or the third dog and you had to do the training yourself. How well did that translate for you?
Well, I am not going to sell myself as any kind of an expert on dog training.
Mm-hmm.
The first Brittany pup I bought, was from a banker in eastern Kansas who bred backyard Brittany's, and hunted quail more than I think he did any banking. And that dog was just a talent. And the thing, looking back over all the dogs now, you've handled so many dogs. I'm sure you've seen it over and over and over again, but everyone is different, and strengths, weaknesses, and takes a little while after you've read the books and tried to translate that into what happens with a real dog. It took a little while for me to realize that how much different they can be. And the first one was a gift from the Red Gods. I mean, it was, I did the yard training, which I'd had some experience with. And so we had the obedience stuff down rock solid. And I don't even think I showed him a live bird. I think I was working him on, in those days, I was working him on a wing and a pole to staunch him up pointing. Mm-hmm. I was, by the end of his first season, I was working blind hand signal retrieves with him, for crying out loud. And that's something I've not achieved with any other Brittany I've ever had. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I was too inexperienced to know what I had with that first dog that I really trained. And I thought I was a heck of a hand when it came to dog training.
Oh, this is easy. Right.
And it was the second one that, I looked at and said, okay. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm dealing with one now. Back in the day, my impression was that Brittany's as a breed for pointing breeds, had an exceptionally strong retrieving instinct as a group and had to be staunched down on the pointing side. My general observation, you can tell me you know far more about this than I do, but my general observation is that retrieving is essentially a coursing instinct, a chasing instinct at its base, and pointing is a stalking instinct. And so they I won't say that they're at odds with each other, but they're different kinds of basic reactions to a stimulus. And with the Brittany's, the first three I had, exceptional retrieving dogs just right out of the box. I didn't have to force train them. They were just great retrievers. I had to work a little bit to get them staunched down on scent. Mm-hmm. I'm working with one right now that I'm looking at that's sprawled, looking ridiculous in his box after a morning after pheasants. Just the reverse. He's been staunched, no problem, but I'm looking at some version of force training in order to get him to really retrieve. Yeah. And so, as I say, something that somebody like you had to deal with and solve, in a matter of months when you take it on the way you've taken it on. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's one dog and then 13, 14 years and then another dog. Mm-hmm. And so the light dawned much more slowly.
Well, it's, the thing with dogs is that when you're handling is that you reach a point where you don't have to handle anymore. And I'm sure you've experienced this with you had a dog, you come up as a youngster with you. Maybe it happens at 3 years old, maybe it happens at 7 years old, but you think a thing and the dog does it. Or you intend to do something and the dog is already waiting for you to follow through, and there's a communication on that deep level that really transcends any kind of formal training or any kind of, structured thing you can implement. It's like two people that have lived together a long time finishing each other's sentences.
Yeah.
You think it and they think it, or vice versa. Cause I know I'll get a thought in my mind and the dog is actually waiting for me to connect through eyesight to tell me, hey, you got the doggy door and I can't get to the water bucket, or or, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's, when you live with a dog, it's a very, very intimate relationship when you truly live with a dog.
Yeah.
And really often deeper relationship than a human on human relationship. They're just so deeply, deeply a part of us.
Yeah. My introduction in this book, starts out with my relationship with that first setter. I'm the only child in my family who can even remember having gotten that dog, I think I was 3.5, something like that. And so, as I said in the book, we were raised and trained together. And that kind of bond only happens once in a human's life. Start out with a dog at 3 or 4 years old, and the next 17 years you're brethren. But I went on to talk a lot more about the prehistory and some of the genetics that convinced me that we've domesticated quite a few species. But I think the history and prehistory of the relationship between humans and dogs is so much longer and for a number of reasons, so much deeper, that I think it's fair to say that we didn't exactly domesticate the dog. We co-evolved with the dog. Depending on who you want to trust.
Yeah.
There's some mitochondrial DNA analysis that suggests that the split between the wolf line and the domestic dog line might have happened as much as 100,000 years ago. And, that's like a third to a half of all of the history of Homo sapiens on the planet Earth. And that doesn't count the likelihood that there was a symbiotic relationship between canines and humans long before humans ever controlled the breeding of canines. It was a cooperative kind of a thing. And if I'm even close to being right about that, goats were domesticated about 12,000 years ago, they say. Cattle about 10,000 years ago. Cats about 7,000 years ago. All of a sudden you're talking about a species that has been at the fireside with human beings for tens of thousands of years before any of that other stuff happened. And so I think some part of the intimacy that you're talking about arises from that biological reality. And then the other thing, of course, is when you take a look at social behavior in wild canids, and compare it with social behavior in humans, it's spooky how much, similarity there is between the two species, even if they aren't in contact with each other. But I argue that it's an unusual person you find that doesn't, that can't read a lot of the body language of a dog. They may not own dogs. They may not know anything about dogs. They still are likely to be able to read a lot about how a dog is thinking, feeling, interacting. And I don't think that's accidental. We've been together for a long, long, long time.
And I just wonder how well the dogs read us.
Oh gosh.
And probably much more intuitive because we have eyesight, and we probably have some sort of vestigial, residual kind of association with scent cues, maybe, possibly. But the dog's primary association with us is through scent. Okay, so they're certainly monitoring our body position or vocal cues we're using. And there's something about that telepathy kind of process. But they also have the ability to use their nose. They know when we're tired, sad, in grief, ill, happy, joyous. They can cue the room through their nose, and they really understand us. And I know, I've got a little wire hair female here named Scout, and, I had some medical stuff here a few years back. And Scout would, I was pretty sick for a while, and, every morning, the very first thing that Scout does, I can be laying in bed just awake, or I can go to sit down in the chair with oatmeal, right? But the very first thing she does when she greets me is she goes right to my mouth and smells my breath. And she's like surveying. She said, "Are you okay today? You know, is it past? Are you all right?" And she monitors that, and then she'll flick, quick tongue flick and lick my face. And then she starts her day. Everything's fine. But she has to check in every morning through scent to get a readout on am I all right? And so that's, we humans, I don't think we really follow that. We don't tend to monitor that.
I've been working on another book, actually. I was looking at some of these broader issues of levels of consciousness in living beings.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great paper that was published in a philosophical journal in about 1975, I want to say. And the title is, "What is it like to be a bat?" Mm-hmm. And the writer talks about the state of knowledge of bats, echolocation, physiology, structure, all that kind of thing at that time. And his final conclusion is that there's no way on the face of the planet a human being can empathize, can really grok what it's like to be a bat. And when I look at a dog in the field, or around the house, it exactly as you're saying, that the view of reality that animal has is so much different than mine. It's just, and I think there's unfortunately, at least in Western culture, there's a substantial hubris attached with being a human being. And, I look at it and you just have to respect that amazing capacity and that different perspective.
I know that folks who live with different animals will often express the same thing about the particular animal or animals they're focused on. And I had a great conversation. I don't know if you know Randy Babb. He's retired here recently. He was with Arizona Game and Fish and a biologist. And Randy was their reptile guy. And then he came up through the ranks and public information officer, that sort of thing. But I talked with Randy about rattlesnakes. And, certainly we humans, and I see this all the time in trainings, we humans have a certain perception of the world. As you described it, a hubris about the superiority of our existence, of our perception of the world as we know it. And in training dogs, there's a second entity there, the dog, and that it would help you if you're going to be a good, successful dog trainer to have some understanding of how dogs perceive the world and how they sense things and how their culture works, how their language works, that sort of thing. But in the aversion work that I do, there is a third party in the equation, and that's the snake. And we humans tend to think that snakes are non-sentient, sort of automatons that just exist. They pop up out of the ground one day and then they disappear again. And that's not the case. They have a complete culture.
Not at all. There's a style. Yeah. I've gotten to the point where I look at it and say, I don't know whether I would stretch it even to inanimate objects, although I'm inclined to do that, just emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
But intellectually speaking, what I know about biology, which is quite a little bit, each species has its own consciousness, by which I mean, a definition, its own sensory analysis of its surroundings, and then the use of the sensory information to enhance survival. To me, that's consciousness. Mm-hmm. And if you define it that way, yeah, human beings are conscious, you bet. And our style of consciousness combined with our, anatomy and physiology has made us a pretty successful critter. But every other living thing on the planet, for crying out loud, can make the same brag. Mm-hmm. 4.5 billion years ago, life started on the planet. There have been winners and losers ever since, and the organisms that survive today are the winners, all of them. And the various recipes of consciousness, sentience, the ability to interact with the environment to exploit it for survival and reproduction is kind of pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, humans are better at human consciousness than any other species is at human consciousness. But bats are pretty darn good at bat consciousness, and dogs are amazing at canine consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And that's really hard to get across to the average dog owner. It's kind of a cultural thing, I think. People are raised to perceive things a certain way. And, some people come up and the dog lives in a cage in the backyard, or, the dog, they would never consider having a dog in the house, or the thought of a dog on a sofa is just, an anathema to what is the proper household conduct, and so much of it is, what a person was raised with or, gifted by the other humans that came before. Because when you see someone that lives with a dog for a time, pretty quick that enmeshment takes place, pretty quick that crossover begins. And I think that dogs really, they tolerate humans pretty well,
Yeah.
I know that when I'm before a group of folks and I'm doing a class, and my job is to help educate them about how their dog perceives the world, so that when they and their dog are out on a walk and it comes across a bad critter, like a rattlesnake, for instance, that it's really helpful for them to be able to look at their dog and know how the dog is seeing the world as opposed to the way they're seeing it. And when I'm before a group of folks, I will typically, I'll spend maybe 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes sometimes, depends on the size of the class, just in sort of an orientation, just kind of talking with them. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm watching the dogs, because dogs live in a world of geography. Again, one of the primary differences between humans and dogs is that we intellectualize, we learn about bad things. We view the world not as a place, but as a place where things happen, independent of that place. And for our dogs, they view the world in terms of geography. So if a bad thing happens, it's not the thing, it's the place where it happens that's to be avoided.
Fascinating that you'd say that, because my young male Brittany here, we were crossing an intersection, and I had the window in my pickup truck rolled down because it was summertime, and he was in the right seat. And right after I crossed this intersection, I don't know whether he saw a rabbit out there or what, but he just decided he was going to leave the vehicle.
Uh-oh.
And so he jumped out and ran up on this bank to check whatever it was going to check, and then looked around and decided it was fairly close to home, quarter of a mile from home, and he looked around and said, well, I guess I'll go to the house. And so he ran back across this busy street. I pulled the vehicle over right away, slammed on the brakes, grabbed the whistle out of my pocket, and blew stop, so that when he got across the streets, so that I could, connect with him. And he decided and he was well broke to a stop whistle command. But on that particular occasion, he decided he was going to come back. Mm-hmm. And so in horror, I watched him start to cross the street again, and he ran into a vehicle, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
But a young dog, just like a Gumby. You know, I mean, he was clearly contused, bruised, but not seriously injured.
Mm-hmm.
Thank the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But even now, 2.5 or 3 years after that, 2 years, I suppose, after that happened, I can't, when I have him on a walk, even on a leash, I can't cross the street at that intersection.
Mm-hmm.
He simply won't go there. And when we go across it in a vehicle, he will lie down and put his chin in my lap as we go across there. Mm-hmm. Like you say, you know, a geography of injury that's going to stick with him, looks like, for the rest of his life.
Well, dogs do not forget bad things. They just don't. And the other component of that, you know, when I'm with folks, and I have a piece of carpeting that I use. I use scent introductions when I'm doing the training, scent and sound introductions. But when dogs are defining that geography, when they find a place that they don't like, that something is bad, then they will mark it. Just like a white-tailed deer flashing a tail to notify the rest of the deer in the group, you know, we better get out of Dodge. They will perspire through the pads of their feet, and they'll leave stress cues on the ground. The saliva that they drip, you know, in their mouth, that has stress cues in it. And so that piece of carpet has had thousands of dogs trained on it. And about every 20th dog will urinate or defecate on it. Again, to leave a scent cue. Once they find this thing and they don't like it, then they smell other dogs were there before them and define that geography, and they said, "Hey, buddy, you don't like this place." They will then leave their message, you know, and that's kind of a critical piece of the training, because then I don't have to be very invasive. They learn everything they learn from another dog. So, and that's the hard part of the training for humans to understand, because we can get a dog to there pretty easy, but then you have to cross it over. So they have to realize that, oh, whoa, wait, it's not the stress cues that are the danger. It's that smell in the middle of it. It's that thing coiled up in the middle of it. That's the reason for those stress cues. Because we humans, you know, we can articulate a concept. We can look down with our superior color vision and we can say, rattlesnake! And everyone knows what that series of tones means in terms of language. And they begin to look for the thing. But it's different for our dogs. They can go in and they can smell that it's a bad place, but they have no way of articulating what it is that you should be looking for that makes it a bad place, you know?
And this situation that I just described is as you lay that out, I'm nodding and saying, yeah, exactly. What would I have liked this young dog to learn? What I would have liked to have him learn from that experience is that cars demand caution. And you should be careful around cars. And what he really learned was that intersection is a bad spot. Mm-hmm. And so I can't trust him. I mean, and he's far better trained and, you know, watch him, you know, really carefully in those kinds of circumstances than he was then. But I can see that he has absolutely no negative associations with vehicles going by on a road. If I stop next to a road and tell him to stop before we cross, you know, he's fine. He's just fine. He won't allow me to take him to that intersection anymore. So kind of look at it and say, damn, I sure wish you'd managed to connect that a little differently. It would be far more adaptive. Yeah.
And there's ways to do that, but you'd have to, what he probably got from that is that something about that place really makes Dad worried and concerned. And that's probably the biggest piece of what he took from that.
Yeah,
is that
would be an accurate assessment.
Okay. Yeah. Cause you had to be throwing off some serious chemical process, you know, when.
Oh man.
Right. And he no doubt heard that in the tone of the whistle you blew. That's why he didn't freeze. That's why he returned you, because he could sense that. Dad's in trouble, you know?
Jeez. So you're putting this on me.
Well, just saying. Well, no, that's a terrifying situation. And I've had it happen a time or two myself, you know? But you see an old grizzled old dog trainer and they can control feeling or control emotion. And that's a really, you have to train yourself to do that. That's a difficult thing.
And again, I wish I'd talked to you about this 35 years ago. You know, I was training dogs in my late 20s, you know, it was hard to keep temper out of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a while to figure out. And honestly, I learned it first with little children,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that not only is temper not useful in a training situation, essentially, but it is so corrosive to any kind of progress.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned earlier about, you know, the things dogs teach us,
Mm-hmm.
how they train us.
Mm-hmm.
And I was slow picking up that lesson, but at some point did finally realize that, getting upset with a dog is counterproductive. It not only doesn't get me where I want to go, it actually moves me further away from where I want to go.
Yeah. And it generally means you did something wrong. You set up a structure that was ineffective or counterintuitive to the dog, or, because dogs generally will comply if they understand what it is that you need them to do, you know.
Yep.
Generally will. Well, I was describing in those trainings when I'm talking with people, okay, because and you know how it is when you're speaking in front of the room, you're looking to connect with those people in the room. And we typically, you see people, their eyes on you. You see them following you. You see them listening or trying to hear. Okay. And you know you've made a connection and they're with you in the conversation you're having. Okay. And the dogs are sort of, you know, smelling each other's butt and going la-di-da-di-da. And, you know, I look for them to get calm. I look for them to get comfortable with the other dogs that are there. And then I start talking to them in their language. And I tell a story about a lab that I had and how I would use him in training and he would talk to the dogs. And I use the sounds that he would use to those dogs. And it's fascinating because immediately their eyes come right to me like, what the heck? I mean, this guy speaks dog. What, you know, and then I get the second component in that conversation that I need to pull in. Okay. So I have the humans and the dogs. And then we can proceed with the training. And from that point on, they follow me. The dogs are looking to me for an explanation because somehow I can understand them, you know, or I maybe partly one of them or something. So dogs gauge the world. They communicate very effectively, and mostly it's with themselves, and they'll kind of condescend to talk to us now and then, you know, and they'll come for affection, and they will share affection, and they'll nurture even sometimes. But they kind of have their own world too, and their own culture and their own. Yeah.
I have a 7-year-old female right now with this 3-year-old male, and watching the development of that relationship is fascinating. And the female's been spayed, so, you know, she's not coming into heat.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't neutered the male yet, and I've routinely done that in the past, and it's only recently have I become aware of some of the
health concerns,
some of the information that's coming to light or has come to light about neutering male or female dogs and the unexpected, unforeseen, deleterious side effects that can occur.
Yeah.
But, you know, little lady suffers this young guy reasonably well most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fascinating to watch when she decides, no, this is enough.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, since he's known her since he was a puppy, there's a weird, not weird, but it dilutes the dominance relationship that he would otherwise feel.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's the junior member.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fascinating. It's interesting to watch him deal with her as well.
Mm-hmm.
But about half the time that I've had dogs, I've had more than one dog in the house at a time. And when we finally ended up with 3 at one time, 3 house dogs, one of them an old Cocker Spaniel, but the other 2 pretty hot rod field dogs, my wife finally put her foot down and said, no, 3 is enough, maybe about 1 too many.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we're back up to 2 right now.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you say, the interaction in society that's going on there is a universe apart from anything that relates to their relationship with the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I like dogs. And some people don't, and I understand that. Some people are goat people, but typically folks can connect with other species, horse people, whatever, and it enriches our lives when we do that. It just it makes our lives bigger.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I describe in the book buying an unexpected opportunity to buy a pup.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on a hunting trip with good friends, and this opportunity arises, and I buy the puppy. And I'm in eastern Kansas, and I'm living in Cheyenne at that point. I'd intended at the end of that day to get a cheap hotel room someplace and go home the next day. All of a sudden, I've got a 7.5-week-old puppy along with my 9.5-year-old male. And I immediately recognized that there is no hotel room in my immediate future. And the interaction between the old male and the puppy was entertaining, and I'll leave people who want to read about that to read about it. But so I ended up getting home at about 2:30 in the morning, and it is my long practice with a young puppy like that. That separation anxiety is a real thing. And, rather than keep everybody in the house awake, I usually find a place where some sort of an accident is not going to be an issue, a linoleum floor somewhere. And I'll spend the first 2 weeks on the floor with the puppy.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll sleep together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did that. I got a sleeping bag out at 2:30 in the morning and put up the kid barrier that we had to keep the puppy from wandering out on the carpeted areas if she felt the need. Next morning, I wake up and one of my daughters is looking down at this puppy, and I said, "A puppy!" And she goes scrambling upstairs to tell her sisters, and I drifted off again because it had been a short sleep and a long night.
Yeah.
And I heard a puppy and looked up, and it was my wife in her pajamas. And she was not nearly as enthralled with the idea of an unexpected pup coming into the house.
Yeah.
And so I mumbled through my explanations, and finally she smiled and sat down and made a little squeak. And when I was heading toward the bathroom, the puppy was curling up on her lap.
Mm-hmm. And that's all it took, right? Yeah.
I said that was the first favor that little puppy ever did for me. The first of many.
Yes, yes. Dear wife, I know you have concerns. Can you just hold him for a minute while I go use the restroom? Strategy 101, right?
I remember a friend of my dad's who was heavy into beagles, and had an opportunity to buy a beagle and a puppy, and bought the beagle puppy, and on Christmas morning, his wife came down, and he went out in the utility room and got this little puppy that had a red ribbon around its neck and a little note that said, "I don't have a mommy. Will you be my mommy? And Dad said that was hitting below the belt. That was really unfair.
Yeah. Well, tell us about your book. I'm excited to see it, and I'm sure that folks will have a good time vicariously following your association with dogs by reading the book.
Well, I hope so. It's split. It's 3 main parts: morning, midday, and evening, and those are grouped with experience with pups in their first year, and in the center of the book, dogs at the peak of their powers, and then dogs in the evening of their lives. And I make the point at the beginning of that those dogs are almost surrounded by an aura at that time in their lives. It's almost palpable, a glow that it has to be experienced to be believed. And then, of course, losing dogs. And these are stories about family, about interaction with family and friends, and with all those various working dogs over the years. And then the introduction is an extended consideration of our prehistoric, essentially phylogenetic relationship with our dogs, that explains why I find, at least, I'm a wildlife biologist, a wildlife person. I've got huge affection for a whole spectrum of wild and tame things. But personally, I feel that my relationship with the dogs is qualitatively different from just about any other relationship I have. Yeah. And that first chapter is an effort to try to understand that a little bit better. And then for people who have waited all the way through the book, I got to the very end. This is not a celebration of shooting. It's not a celebration of filled bag limits. It's about dogs and people in the house and in the field. But talking about field dogs, about upland bird dogs, and a lot of stuff dies tangentially through the main part of the book. And so the last chapter is a Reader's Digest version of my thoughts. The title is About the Killing, and is an effort to try to communicate what I think about that. So the very first chapter and the very last chapter are pretty philosophical. The rest of it is anecdotal, strung on the thread of 60 plus years of relationships with dogs.
Yeah. Well, where can folks get a copy?
Well, publisher, bless their hearts, have already got it posted on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So if you want to just go out there and click there, you can certainly buy a copy through those major sources. People who want to get in touch with me, I'd sign a copy for somebody. I've got a growing list. Right now I'm waiting for the next shipment of books. So I'm going to be 2 or 3 weeks before I can actually start to send some of these out. But if people would like to have one signed, I'd be more than happy to sign one. And they can reach me at chrismadson@me.com. That's CHRISMADSON @me.com.
And for our listeners, we'll have that in the metadata. So you can go and check the metadata list for the podcast, and that information will be there for you.
Excellent. Much appreciate that. And you've had this experience, I know. It's always such a warming thing to reach out blindly to people in the expectation that there might be somebody else out there who shares a certain point of view, a certain passion with you. And even just as this book has just been announced coming out. I'm having that experience, and it's just a marvel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we are pushing our time, and it's been such a pleasure. I want to thank you for spending the time with us. And I know we're interrupting the middle of your pheasant hunt.
Actually, I've got birds to clean.
I am jealous. Wish I was there with you, but I just want to let folks know that it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you. And it is time to sign off. We're at our allotted hour. If you do have an interest, please do hit the subscribe button. It does help us. And we look forward to talking with you in the future. This is Webb Parton signing off, Free Range Dogs, hoping and wishing you a wonderful, joyful day with your favorite canine companions. Take care. If you like this episode, I invite you to visit our website, freerangedogs.com. It's where you can find the stuff you need to live the free-range dog lifestyle. I want to help you with that. Book a consultation call or an in-person training, attend one of our ongoing events, or join our online membership program. We got it all on freerangedogs.com. All right, it's time to head back to the truck and the water bucket for the thirsty dogs. This is Webb Parton signing off, wishing you the boundless joy that comes when you share the outdoors with your best friend.